This reading is from Judges 4. After Ehud had died, the people of Israel kept right on doing evil in God's sight. So the Lord gave them over to King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, and he was stationed in Harosheth Hagoyim. The Israelites cried out to the Lord because Sisera had 900 iron chariots and had oppressed the Israelites cruelly for 20 years. Now Deborah was a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth. She was judge over Israel at that time. She held court under Deborah's palm between Ramah and Bethel in the hills of Ephraim. The Israelites went up to her there. They came to her to decide cases for them, to settle disputes. She sent word to Barak, Abinoam's son, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him,
Hasn't the Lord, Israel's God, issued a command? He says, go. Take 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun with you, then lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, into a trap. I'll have him assemble with his chariots and troops against you at the Kishon River, and then I'll hand him over to you.
Barak replied to her,
If you'll go with me, I'll go, but if not, I won't go.
All right, I'll go with you. But because of the way you're doing this, you won't receive any honor. Instead, the Lord will hand Sisera over to a woman.
Then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. He summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 men marched out behind him. Deborah marched out with him too. It happened that Heber the Kenite had parted company with the other Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' in-law. He was now living at Zaananim Oak near Kadesh. Heber's people told Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor. Sisera immediately called up all his chariots to the Kishon River, 900 iron chariots, along with all his troops who were with him at Harosheth Hagoyim. Then Deborah said to Barak,
Get up. This is the day that the Lord has handed Sisera over to you. Hasn't the Lord gone out before you?
So Barak charged down the slopes of Mount Tabor with 10,000 men behind him. The Lord threw Sisera and all the chariots and army into a panic before Barak. Sisera himself got down from his chariot and fled on foot. Barak pursued the chariots and the army all the way back to Harosheth Hagoyim, killing Sisera's entire army with the sword. No one survived. Meanwhile, Sisera, running for his life, headed for the tent of Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite. Sisera ran there because there was a treaty between Heber's family and Jabin, the king of Hazor. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him,
Come in, sir. Stay here with me. Don't be afraid.
So he went with her into the tent, and she hid him under a blanket. Sisera said to her,
Please, give me a little water to drink. I'm thirsty.
So she opened a jug of milk, gave him a drink, and hid him again. Then he said to her,
Stand at the entrance to the tent. That way, if someone comes and asks you, Is there a man here? You can say no.
But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent stake with a hammer. While Sisera was sound asleep from exhaustion, she tiptoed to him. She drove the stake through his head and down into the ground, and he died. Just then, Barak arrived after chasing Sisera. Jael went out to him and said,
Come, and I'll show you the man you're after.
So he went in with her, and there was Sisera, lying dead, with the stake through his head. So on that day, God brought down Canaan's king Jabin before the Israelites, and the power of the Israelites grew greater and greater over Canaan's king Jabin until they defeated him completely.
A while back, Dan came to me and said, hey, let's do a series on women. And why don't you work it up? So I worked it up, and he said, hey, I'm going on sabbatical. Have fun with that. And then just before he left, he said, hey, by the way, you might want to include Ellie in it. Having this whole series was her idea. So here we are. And so I asked Ellie, I said, do you want to talk about Deborah and Jael, or do you want to talk about Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist? And she said, oh, give me the tent peg. I want that. So that is where we are. And the very fact that she knew about the tent peg told me I had the right person for this story. So just to give you a little understanding of where the story happens, there's a couple of things. We're at the beginning of the Iron Age, and really we're at a point where the people have left Egypt. They had Moses as a leader all through that time in the wilderness. Then Moses, as he died, Joshua was called by God to be their leader. And Joshua was leading them in, and they went into the promised land and fit the battle of Jericho and watched the walls fall down, and things were going well. And then they kind of bogged down. And they started marrying people from there in Canaan, and all these spreading out and taking land, and things started happening before they had finished taking all the land. And of course, it wouldn't fully happen until we get to the time of David. So we're in this period. Joshua has died right at the beginning of Judges, and there's not this next the person. And so they're turning away from God. God calls a judge and gives that judge some extraordinary power, and that judge comes in and wipes out the oppressors of them in that situation, and then you'll have a period where they follow God. And then it'll say that after that judge, then they went back to turning away from God. And then they call out to God because they get judgment from God, and God brings another judge. And so there have been 3 men already in Judges, and then we get to this story in chapter 4. And so that's the story that was narrated for you just before we came up here. So that's a little context of where we are when this whole thing happens. So I asked Ellie to just converse with me. I'm going to read this because it feels like it's in the way. So, Ellie, what you got?
Something that has always made me curious about this story is that this is included in the canon of the Bible, and this is a very female-led story, and then we have Judith, and that's not included in most biblical canon. Why do you think that is?
I looked into that some, and what happened was when the Jewish people came out of Babylon and out of that exile, that's when they really gathered together and formed what is their canon, what is the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh that they use as their set of canon scriptures. And then after they did that, they were translated into Greek. And when they were translated into Greek, some more stories that were around, but were not in that canon that they had set, were out there, and they went into the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And so when we get to Jesus' time, both exist, the Hebrew versions and the Septuagint. And the Septuagint is in the Greek that is of the day, and the old scriptures are in Hebrew that's changing, and some of it is very old. I described it to a group of people I was teaching a few weeks ago as like if we were trying to look at Beowulf. Would you read Beowulf in the original English, or would you want to read it in the current English? I mean, it's a wide variety of language. And so the Catholic Church Bibles still have all of those apocryphal. When Martin Luther came along, he said, we as Christians should just be using the ones that were canonized by the Jews. And so he removed all of those from Scripture. And so Judith left during that time. So it's out there, it's in your Apocrypha, you can read it. It's part of the canon in the Eastern Church, in the Roman Church, in the Ethiopian Church, but not in the Protestant world. And Judith applies to this. I understand her asking it because there's a lot of similarities in the story. There's an oppressor. This woman, Judith, comes up. She serves the oppressor some dairy products. The oppressor goes to sleep, and she kills the oppressor. So it's a lot of similarity to what happens in this story. So, great question. So, looking at the story, in chapter 4, we have the narrative that we just heard. In chapter 5, we have the ballad, the Song of Deborah and Barak, it's called, and it retells the story in song. And so I'm curious, which one do you like better, the narrative or the ballad?
I'm really glad you asked this, because I think it's perfect evidence for why we should never have broken the Bible up into chapters in the first place. That was a really horrible decision, because honestly, you need 4 and 5. They're kind of codependent on each other, because without 4, you won't understand 5. But without 5, you don't see this side of Deborah that makes her a great leader, which is that she lifts up other people. Like in the entirety of that book, several times she lifts up Jael, says she is one of the most blessed women, and goes on to raise up other people and say, I'm praying for this person, I'm praying for this person, and really doesn't try to overfocus on herself. I also love that Deborah specifically points out that Jael serves him milk instead of water, and is like, she served him milk instead of water, and is kind of lifting her up for that. And really most importantly, though, is the fact that at the very end of that, we find out that there was 40 years of peace, following all of these events. And it's sort of a testament to Deborah's character, again, that after this huge battle, there's another 4 decades of peace, and I think just further proof of her character.
Yeah, I agree that you really can't, like one of the things that you get in the ballad that you can't really understand in the narrative is when the battle starts, in the ballad you see that a great thunderstorm has come in. And so the Sisera's army that has the latest technology, they have iron chariots. Well, when the rains all come down and they're down in the valley, it bogs all those chariots down, causes the chaos in Sisera's troops, and allows this army of Israel that is coming in, who knows, hoes and pitchforks and just not nearly technologically advanced weaponry of what Canaan had at that time, allows them to come in and still win the battle. And the battle is won because God did the work to allow them the condition to win the battle. So.
And with this epic battle and how just epic it is and how very interesting it is and the storytelling is so amazing, why don't you think it's talked about more in theological circles?
Judges doesn't get talked about a lot, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, for many of the mainline churches, there's the lectionary, and the lectionary takes 3 years and tries to cover most of the Bible in 3 years. And so each week there's an Old Testament passage, a psalm, a gospel, and one of the letters. There's passages from each of those. And in a lot of churches, the minister just picks what they're preaching each week based on one of those scriptures, one of those 4 for that week that's in the lectionary. And if they're doing that well, then as they preach over time, they're going to cover most of the Bible. But the lectionary doesn't cover all the Bible. In fact, in Judges, the only piece it covers is this chapter and only the first 7 verses. So you don't get Jael at all, you don't get the ballad at all, and you don't get any of the rest of Judges in the lectionary. So on one side, because so many of our churches that we've been in have had people following that, you get that. The other is, Judges is what I call the Greek tragedy of the whole Bible. It starts out, God's bringing these judges, and there's these good judges that come in, and every time they turn away, then a good judge comes in, and we get 40 years after Deborah of them living in peace and living in the way of God, and then they turn again from God, and then you bring in the next judge. And what happens as it goes along is, when you get later in the story, the judges start to become as corrupt as the people. instead of turning the people from corruption, they get to where they are as corrupt. You get the story of Samson is later in Judges, and we know that Samson made many terrible choices and did not do any real leading of the people. He just did his own thing. And then after you get the story of Samson, the last story, they basically turn against the tribe of Benjamin and wipe them almost completely out. This story is gruesome that we're doing today. That story is 10 times more gruesome, and it is just not good news. And most of us don't want to hear bad news, and some of us don't want to read horror. I don't watch horror movies. I've never seen American Horror Story. I never will. It's just not my thing. So I think the trying to deal with the gruesome scenes, because there are several in Judges, and the sadness of it being a tragedy rather than a triumph. We tend to want to get to David and the triumph and Solomon and the wisdom, and we want to skip over this period of time. We kind of want to do that in our own lives too.
I will say, I think it is interesting, though, that like when we say Samson, everyone's like, oh yeah, we know that guy. But we know who Samson is, and most of us don't know who Deborah is. And that's funny to me because we have this judge who is a paragon, who is an amazing judge, and then we have Samson, and everybody remembers Samson and not her whenever she's this, incredible judge. And I don't know, maybe this is just selfishness talking, but a part of me wonders if the fact that she is a paragon, but that she is a leader and she's living in this time period where female and leader are never really used in the same sentence. I think that may have impacted that personally.
I think being a woman in Scripture is almost being guaranteed of being held down a little. Many of the women don't have names at all, and we don't lift up many of the women who do show such faithfulness and such beauty in the way they live their lives. And there's been a tendency for us to look. One of the things about Deborah is when you read the narrative, she's really not trying to get all the glory and the honor. She's trying to offer it to Barak, and then she tells him it's going to be a woman. And for most of us, when you read the story and you hear it's going to be a woman, you're like, oh, well, then she's getting the glory, until you get to the very end, and then suddenly Jael comes in and she gets the glory. And when you read the ballad, Deborah's lifting them up and lifting all the other people up. And that's a very different leadership style than most men have, especially in the Bible and in this patriarchal time. So I think that is also, we like to look at Solomon killing 10,000 men with an ass's jawbone, but we don't like to look at Deborah and see how she was inclusive in her leadership and victory. So I agree. So what about Jael?
Okay, I could talk forever about her, but I'm not going to do that because then we'd be here forever. But what I like about her is that she's sort of treated like just a normal woman. And it's a really great message, I think, because as young women, it's like either you're told that, you need to go and you need to be independent and you're strong and you're fierce, or you're Cinderella. But what's important is that you can be both or you can be neither. And with Jael, she's just in her tent, hanging out, and we know that she's the wife of so-and-so, we know that she's this and this, but the important thing, I think, with her is that she just takes the opportunity she's given, and she's a great role model for women in how women love people, which is that you take on the role that the people who love you need you to be in that moment. And it's not about giving herself glory. It's not about, okay, I'm going to do this because I'm asserting my dominance as a woman. It's just because she cares about these people, and God gives her an opportunity, and she takes it. And that shows her faith, I think, and it shows how God comes to women and just puts us in these positions where we get to make that choice.
So what do you see God doing in the story? Where do you see God's action?
I gotta get my notes out for this one. I think, and this may be controversial, I think it's proving that the biggest difference in male characters and female characters in the Bible is, again, how God approaches them. He says, Moses, okay, you need to come and do this. Okay, David, you need to come and beat Goliath. You need to come and be a king. Joseph, you need to go and interpret these dreams. And like all these people they're called out to do something. And then with the women of the Bible, it's always like, oh, you're a virgin. You're going to carry the Lord and Savior of the world, by the way. He tends to meet women where they are. And that's not saying that one is greater or one is lesser, but it's very important to understand how God interacts with us. Because I think as women, sometimes we're sitting around waiting for God to come and call us out, like he calls out Gideon, like he calls out David, like he calls out, and we were waiting for that. But most of the time with us, he just puts an opportunity right there and we have to take it. Whether that's stabbing somebody through the head with a tent peg or just loving someone and taking care of them. And Rahab, sheltering people, whoever you are, we're always given opportunities. And the most faithful women in the Bible are the ones who just are where they are approached by God, and take those opportunities and are faithful.
Really good.
Thank you.
I mean, that really struck me. We've known the questions, but we don't know the answers coming into this. I'm trying to think of the times where men just took what God was giving in front of them instead of having had to be called out and told by God, this is what you have to do. And that's really very insightful that the women they're just met where they are. They're already doing these things that you can see God in their life, and then they're just there. Boom. See, you learn something new every day.
Well, on that topic of calling out men and calling out women, this is something that some people have talked to me about and come up to me and approached me about. They're like, okay, well, you think Deborah is this feminist story in the Bible. Well, how can I, as a male, how can I relate to that? And I'm like, I don't know, because I'm not male, I'm sorry. But what do you think, as men reading this story, what do you think you're meant to grasp from this?
I think that the stories are all in there to show us how God works with people, and most often works with the people we don't expect God to work with. Jael is a Kenite. A Kenite is the in-laws of Moses. When Moses went out and started being a shepherd, he married a Kenite. And so when the people of Israel left Egypt and were going to the Promised Land, the Kenites joined in with them and went into Israel with them. So they weren't part of the 12 tribes, but they were part of the community. And this story makes a big point that Jael's husband has left the rest of the Kenites and gone and is working with the Canaanites, living with and working with them. It's his people that tell Sisera that the Israelites are coming. You better get your troops together. I mean, so her husband is working for the Canaanites, not the Israelites. And she's a Kenite, she's not an Israelite. So we don't expect her to be the one that God calls to this place of honor. The other thing is, she's not just in a place of honor, she's in a place of great risk. The person who is most at risk in the whole story is her. She's going against her husband, her clan, and she's going against Sisera, the leader of an army. And yet, none of that stops her from doing what she sees needs to be done. And so I think for all of us, that's a message for all of us, not for just the men or just the women. And so many of the stories are like that the gender of the person is less important than the call of the person and the answering the call. Yeah, so the women's stories are just as important. And I would take Deborah's story over Jephthah or Samson's story any day of the week. Well, are there other interesting things you saw about Deborah and Jael you want to?
I guess kind of back on the topic of being surprised, like it can come from anybody, that sort of thing. I also like that Barak comes to Deborah and is like, listen, I need help. And that even though he's not going to receive any glory because he is asking for help, he's not turned away for asking for help. And it's really important, I think, that you have this. I mean, I'm assuming he's some kind of commander. He's in a high position. And he comes and he humbles himself and says, I need help with this. And it's, I think we're discouraged a lot. Everyone, I think we're all kind of discouraged from asking for help. And we're criticized, like, hey, why didn't you just save yourself? And like, it's really damaging for people. I know this is, a lot of people will criticize like the Cinderella story because, well, why didn't she just save herself? Like, what, you know, try to save yourself when you have 3 people in this abusive situation. Where's she gonna go, right? We can't criticize people for not always knowing what to do. And it's actually really good and it's really healthy that we have this example of someone who is obviously very skilled, obviously knows what he's doing, but acknowledges that in this moment he's unsure and that he wants to seek the help of others, and that's sort of celebrated by the story, and that Deborah's helping him is part of also what makes her such a great leader.
Yeah, I think if you're reading this story in the Hebrew from the understanding I'm given of it, you can't tell who the judge is while you go through the narrative. Like Deborah she's sitting under a tree, she's listening to God, she's offering to help with people in their issues, but that's not what we've seen a judge be in these other judges that have come up. They've all come up and been these military leaders, and we're going to have Gideon after this, who's a military leader, and so suddenly you have this woman who's a judge, and she's sitting under a tree helping people with their disputes. So does that make her the judge of the story? Because the leader of the fighters has been the judge. So then you have to wonder as you're reading it, well, is Barak actually the judge? Or did he give that up when he said, I need you to be with me? And so then Deborah, again, is the judge. Or is Jael the one who actually gives the final victory, the judge? It's not as clearly stated in this one who the judge is. It's almost a shared community thing, which also makes sense to me in it being a female judge instead of a male judge, that they find their power in a community situation rather than in I've got to take the hero's journey. So.
Awesome. Read Judges, it's weird, it's good.
I hope that, first off, just incredibly impressed with Ellie, with all her knowledge and with her insight into what she knows, with the way that she has dwelled on it. I could see her sitting under a tree, listening to God and helping us with our problems. And so I appreciate greatly the work you put in to do this and for your idea for this whole series. And I hope that for all of us, when we see the story, we do see that God's going to work to God's ends. But God's going to give human freedom. So Barak's told, this is what God has said. And he goes, well, I'll do it if, and changes the plan. And God still gets what God wants, but the plan changes, and who carries what role changes. And so when we're looking at our lives, sometimes it's time for us to carry the big part of the burden, and sometimes it's somebody else's, and sometimes it's only going to work if we all carry it together. But God's going to work to God's ends in any way and still allow us the freedom to be who we are and be where we are. The other thing that is that God's going to use the people we don't expect, whether they're inside God's people or outside God's people. God's going to use the people that God sees and wants, whether they're an Israelite, a Kenite, a Christian, or a Buddhist. If they are following what God has envisioned for creation, God will use them for the means that an end that God has. And so for us to remember that Jesus said, if they're not against us, they're for us, as we encounter people and recognize that God is working beyond everything we understand. Let's pray.